This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
All right. So I want to start in India, in Maharashtra, which is in Western India, in 1977. And I was 22, and I'd sort of been on the hippie trail. I'd hitchhiked from England to India, overland through Afghanistan and so on. And I'd got sort of disillusioned with that lifestyle. I spent the last 3 years traveling, traveling all over the place. But I felt disillusioned with that lifestyle. And I came down to Delhi from the hills, from the Himalayas, and I was in the bazaar in Old Delhi, and I met a French guy who I travelled with in Ladakh, and I just found myself asking him, where can I learn meditation? And he told me that there was a Burmese teacher called Goenka, who some of you have heard of, I'm sure, who was leading a course in Maharashtra in about 10 days' time, and that I could travel with him. And I did this meditation course with Goenka, and it was really extreme. So we meditated for 10 days in almost complete silence, and we didn't have any meditation gear at all. I just had to sit on whatever I had on a stone floor. And we meditated for 10 hours a day. And the first day was mindfulness of breathing. And then the other 9 days were Vipassana meditation, looking at the impermanence of sensations in the body. And it was a life-changing event as it happened. But in a way, I did have some meditation experiences, but they weren't the most important thing. What the most important thing was that every evening, Goenka would give a little Dharma talk, and it was like one of our basic Buddhism talks, about the life of the Buddha, about Buddhist ethics, and so on. And the thing was that I just knew it was true. I just knew straight away that it was true. And it was as if I discovered values that I could live by, that I wanted to base my life on. They were Buddhist values. And before that, I was sort of, I suppose in a way, I didn't really know how to live, and I didn't know what values to base my life on. I wasn't convinced by Christian values. I didn't believe in the existence of God, and I wasn't convinced by career. There was nothing that I particularly wanted to do. When I went to careers interviews at school, there was nothing I was particularly interested in, and also I didn't particularly want to have a family either, and but I didn't know what to do. And I was only 22. And I could sort of see that it all ended in getting old and dying. I could see that even when I was a teenager, and none of it seemed to be enough. None of it seemed to be enough to add up to a full life. And then here I was on this retreat, and I was hearing these, about Buddhism, and it was very, very familiar to me. And I felt, oh, this is what I really believe, and this is what I've always believed, and so I knew I was a Buddhist. I knew I was a Buddhist, so I knew that was what I was going to do with my life straight away. But also doing all this meditation, it really stirred me up, and it really turned me upside down, inside out. And that took, and I didn't know quite what to do with all of that, because I was quite shaken up by this retreat. In a way, I think it was far too much, too soon, And but I knew I had to change my life, and I knew I couldn't just carry on traveling. So I went back to England, and I decided to go to art college. And I hadn't done any art before, but my sister and my brother were both artists, and they said, "Well, look, if you've lived an interesting life, you'll be getting an art college." So I got a portfolio together. I did some drawings. They told me to do some drawings and some watercolors and other things, and I got all this together. And I went to an interview at Watford, and I got interviewed by this guy called Peter Schmidt, who became a very important person to me. And Peter, he was interviewing me, and he said, he said, "Okay, well, we haven't really got any places, but there might be a place." And then he said, "When you were in India, did you do anything else?" And I said, "Yes, I did a Buddhist meditation retreat." And he said, "Oh, I'm a Buddhist." And then about 3 days later, I got a letter through the post saying I've been accepted on this art course. And really, I learned to really look at paintings and to learn to paint and draw and do printmaking after I got into art college, not before. And it was a very, very good course. And Peter, there's a small group of us who are Buddhists, and we used to meditate with Peter Schmidt in his office at lunchtimes. And then one day, Peter said to me, "There's an English Buddhist talking in London tonight. Would you like to come along?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." And I went with Peter. We went up to London, and we went to a lecture, and the person giving the lecture was Venerable Sangharakshita, our teacher, the teacher of this movement. And at first I wasn't very impressed with him. He had this very long, greasy hair and long sideburns, and terribly badly dressed, like this really dreadful sports jacket. And he had this accent which sounded sort of Jewish. It's a twangy sort of accent. But he said, one of the things he said was, "You can change." So Buddhism is about change, and you can change. And I really wanted to change. And I started going along to, it was the FWBA in those days. It wasn't Triratna. And, at first I just thought, well, they're not real Buddhists, they're just Westerners, and they're just sort of playing at being Buddhists. The real Buddhists were people like Goenka, who was Burmese, or monks and so on. But when I went to the London Buddhist Center, which was just opening then, what I was impressed with was, there are all these young guys there with long hair like me, and about my own age, maybe a little bit older. And I thought, well, look, I'm not going to become Goenka, but I could become an order member. I could actually become a member of the Western Buddhist order. And there was something about the communication that they had between them. It was something about the friendship they had between them. And in a way, it was the first time that I felt people had really listened to me and taken me in, and looked me in the face. And I just wanted more of that. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of that type of communication that whatever these people had. I wanted that. And there was one thing that had struck me very strongly. Goenka on his course. At the end of his course, he said, it doesn't matter which group you practice within. He said there are lots and lots of different paths and lots of different Buddhist teachers, and they all work. All these different traditions work. He said, but you have to stick at them. And he said, it's like if you want to travel from Bombay to New York, you can travel east and you'll get there eventually. Or you can travel west and you'll get there. But if you go a little bit east and a little bit west, you'll never actually arrive. And he said, the Dharma is like that. And so you actually need to commit yourself at some point to, a particular way of practice. And I know that to be true. I've been practicing for over 40 years, and I've seen people who've committed themselves either to Triratna or to another Buddhist movement, and they've kept working away and they've made progress. I know other people who it's just like a spiritual supermarket, and they go from one group to another, and they never actually go deep enough. It's like if you want to draw. There's a saying that if you want to draw water from the well, you have to sink the bucket deep into the well. And it's like that with spiritual practice. You have to go really deeply into one practice, or a system of practice. And, I was just thinking like this evening, we've been practicing the mindfulness of breathing. And I've been doing that for 40 years, and I feel it's still fresh. And I'm still discovering what that practice is about. It's a very simple practice. And it's not the same practice, because if you do practice particular meditations and particular system of practice, you change, and what you actually bring to the practice changes. Your consciousness, as your consciousness evolves, the practices evolve. But you need to actually go quite deeply into them. So anyway, something else happened, and that was that. This was quite decisive. So I was on a retreat in Scotland, and I was talking to an order member, and I said it's really good, with Goenka, because you can gain insight, you can gain enlightenment, and you don't have to change your life. You can live your ordinary life, and you can do this meditation practice, and it'll take you all the way. And I was saying this very enthusiastically, his order member, and he said, "Well, we have a slightly different approach." And he said, it's like you have to bring every aspect of your life into line with the Dharma, and that's the only way it works. So you have to let the Dharma permeate into every aspect of your life if you're going to make progress. So in a way, I think that's where Sangharakshita is different from most other teachers. He's not just a meditation teacher. He's created a whole way of life, a whole way of bringing the Dharma into every aspect of your life, your work, your family life, your ethical life, everything, within a Western context. He's a Westerner himself, and he's done that within a Western context. And I think he's done it very successfully. It's not so developed in Sweden, so you don't see it so much in Sweden, but in the UK, you see a much more, you see it that, it's much more fully developed, really. And a really important part of all this is friendship, and Sangharakshita put a lot of emphasis on friendship. And if you think about it, most of the qualities that we're trying to develop as Buddhists are to do with other people. And you need other people in your practice. It's not just something that you do in the solitude of your own home, practicing the Dharma. It's got a whole other outward regarding aspect as well. You need other people as well, and so we put all this emphasis on Sangha, and within that there are vertical friendships, people you look up to. And then there are horizontal friendships, which are more like peer friendships. And we sort of emphasize both. And what I want to really talk about tonight is some of my own spiritual friends. And I want to talk particularly about Sangharakshita. And I want to talk about my two kalyana mitras, who are, they're not as they're not as advanced as Sangharakshita. They're closer to me, but they're definitely people who I look up to and regard as being more developed than myself. And that's Kamalashila and Padmavajra. Well, Sangharakshita talks about, he's given a lecture called Is a Guru Necessary? Is a Guru Necessary? And he asked the question, well, what is a guru? And he says a guru is not a father figure. He's not a problem solver, although he can function as both of those if he needs to. He's not even a teacher. He's someone who is on a higher plane of spiritual development than yourself, and that through entering into communication with him, you're able to be lifted up yourself in your being. And I want to give a couple of examples of that in my own life. Well, actually, I'll give 3 examples. And I'll have to be very, very brief because I haven't got that much time. So I was never really close to Sangharakshita. You know, it's not like I spent a huge amount of time with him, but he ordained me, and I definitely regard him as my teacher. And I would go to see him if I had something to ask him about, if I had a spiritual question to ask him about, or if I was going to make a decision, like, say, moving to Sweden, which I did. I'd go and see him before making any important decisions. And the first example I'll give is in the 80s, we were very experimental in those days, and I was part of a centre that went wrong. And I don't want to go, it's in Croydon, and I don't want to go into all the details as to how it went wrong, but it did go wrong. There was a very charismatic figure who was leading that centre, and I think he went on a rather distorted path, and I was he was a friend of mine. He did, in many ways, he was a very good friend of mine. But I was part of that, and it ended up with Sangharakshita calling all the order members in my situation to come up and see him, and he just made it very, very clear to us that things had to change, and that if you didn't want those things to change, then you should leave that situation. And this was on an order weekend, and he wanted me and another order member to stay behind afterwards. And there was a chairman's retreat going on, and me and this other order member stayed behind. And I think he thought, he wasn't quite sure that we'd actually taken his point. And he was very, very strong, and he came on very, very strongly. And he was completely uncompromising in what he said. And I was on the receiving end of this. And afterwards, people were coming up to me and they were saying, "Are you okay?" They said, "We've never seen him talk like that before. Are you all right?" And I felt fantastic. And it was as if he'd expressed himself very strongly, but it wasn't anger. It was another quality. It was a bit like, for those of you who are familiar with it, it was a bit like the wrathful energy of Padmasambhava, of Guru Padmasambhava. It was like a Vajra. That's a Vajra, a thunderbolt. And it just cut right through. It cut right through all my defenses, but it cut without wounding. And I felt liberated. And I felt liberated from, the mistakes that I'd made in the past, actually, in that situation. So that was the first instance. And I felt in that instance, he was acting as a guru. He was acting as a Vajra guru. The second instance was quite funny, really, because I'd moved to Sweden, and I'd been chairman in Sweden for 3 years, and I was finding it really difficult, in Sweden. I was in a different culture. I didn't have any peer friends at the time. I was working with Triratna, and then later Virivodi came out. And I missed my friends. I missed the situation in the UK. I missed my culture. It's Sweden is a very different culture from England. You don't notice when you're visiting, but when you live there, you find it is. And then Sona came along, and he said, well, it looks like things are going very well in Sweden, and you could probably leave now, and you could join the ordination team at Papaloka. So I said, great, that sounds really good. And I went back to England, and I went on the chairman's event. I was the chairman here. And I went on the chairman's event, and I said, I'm thinking of leaving and joining the ordination. Everyone was saying, "Oh, that's really good." But I wanted to see Sangharakshita. And on the way back from the chairman's retreat, I went to see Sangharakshita. And he was already in the hall, and he had his coat on, and he wanted to go for a walk. And we went for a walk down the hill, this is in Birmingham, to the park. And he said, "Oh, I hear that you've learned Swedish now, and that you're you're teaching in Swedish. That's very good. And I said, yeah, that's true, Bhante, but did you get my letter? I wrote to you saying that I'm Sona has asked me to join the ordination team. He said, no, I don't remember that. I don't remember any letter. And I said, yes, that's right, Bhante, I did write that. and I said, I think I'd like to be teaching more experienced people now. No. We need our more experienced teachers teaching beginners. Okay. But they want to have a younger people on the ordination team. No. I think we need our older ordination team. And it all went like this, and we're walking around the park, and it's like you're trying to get a conversation over here, and he's pulling it right back over there. And we just sort of lapsed into silence. We're walking up the hill, and he said, well, when you were on the chairman's event, was there anything else? And I said, yes, there was a Scottish order member, and he was talking about starting different groups, in different cities around Scotland. And so Bhante said, well, if you leave Stockholm, I want you to start a centre in Copenhagen. So and then he just said, well, I'll be coming to Sweden in the summer. Goodbye. And he just went. And I was standing on the platform of Birmingham Station, just feeling like the carpet had been taken away from under my feet. And I went back to Sweden. And Sona, who was the president, he phoned me up and he said, I heard what happened with Bhante. He said it'll be much more difficult, in Copenhagen. And I thought about it, and I just decided, okay, well, I'm just going to stay in Sweden, and I'm going to stay there as long as it's needed. I'm not going to put any limit on it. I'm just going to stay as long as I'm needed. And I thought, well, when it's time to leave, I'll just know. And I did, and also I just thought, okay, well, I think part of the reason I was finding it difficult in Sweden was because I had all these ideas of how I wanted the centre to be, and what sort of centre I wanted to create. And I don't think I was really open enough to the people that are coming to the centre. So I just decided, okay, well, I'm just gonna do what people want to do. I'm just going to create the sort of centre that I want, that people want. And even if it's not the sort of centre I want, I'm just going to do I'm just going to respond to what people want and what they need. And it's going to be a Swedish centre. And I'm just going to be an intermediary, until I'm just going to be here long enough until I can pass on to Swedish people. And that's what I did. So I just stayed here. And after another 3 years, I was doing a solitary retreat in the archipelago. And I was coming back on the boat, and I just knew, it's time to leave now. That there's a lot of people have been ordained. The centre was much more established, and I just realised, it's time to leave. And I went to see Bhante again, and I said, look, this has happened in Sweden. We've got these order members, and we had this development, that development. Now I'd like to leave and join the ordination team. How would you feel about that? And he just said, I'd have no objection to that. So that was it, and I left, and I thought about it afterwards, and I realised it was amazing. It was an amazing thing he did. He was just taking me completely seriously, and I'd gone to Sweden with the intention of establishing the centre there, and he wasn't letting me off the hook. He wasn't saying, "Oh no, that's okay. I'm sorry you're having a difficult time. You come back now." He was saying, "No, you haven't really done what you set out to do." And go back and do it. And it really changed my relationship with Sweden. And it meant in those 3 years, I developed, 6 years altogether, I developed a really deep connection with Sweden and with Swedish people. And that's continued to this day, over 20 years later. So he did me it was enormously important teaching. It's like a personal precept. It's an important teaching. And the thing is, what's said about the teacher, there's two things said about the teacher. And the one thing that's said about the teacher is that the teacher has access to the whole Dharma. They've got this very, very broad experience of the Dharma. But what the teacher can do, they can pick out the teaching that you need at any particular time, and give it to you, that little aspect of the Dharma that you need at that particular time. So the Buddha, in a way, can open the door to the Dharma, in a very broad way. He can open up the way to the Dharma, but the teacher can speak to you individually and give you the teaching that you need and in your own particular situation. And I got that. Okay, the last episode I want to mention was, it was probably it was 2018, and it was right at the end of Sangharakshita's life. And I'd been on a solitary retreat in Scotland. That's where you go off by yourself. You have no contact with the outside world at all, and you just practice meditation and you study the Dharma. And I'd gone for 3 months to this place in Scotland, and it was winter time in Scotland. It was right on the edge of a cliff. It was a hut, and storms blew every single day and night. It was just storms and rough sea, and there was nothing you could rest your eyes on that was still. You're just looking out the window and there was this raging sea all the time. And after 7 weeks, I'd had enough. I really, really tried, but after 7 weeks, I'd had enough, and I decided to come back. And because I was contacting my darker side, you could say. I was contacting some quite destructive forces within myself, in the depths of my psyche, and I didn't know how to work with them. When you go on solitary retreat, you can contact all sorts of things, and I went back, and I was at Adhisthana, where Sangharakshita lives, and right at the end, I was on an event there, a college meeting, and right at the end, I decided to go and see him. My friends encouraged me to go and see him, and I went to see him, and he was a very old man there, very, very frail, and he was just sitting in his armchair, and he was 93, and he just leaned right forward, and I had his full attention. I said, "Look, Bhante, I had to come back from a solitary retreat." And he said, "Was it your darker side?" And I said, "Yes, it was, Bhante." And I said, I had these destructive impulses. And he said, "Was it towards yourself or towards others?" I said, "It was both, Bhante." And he said, "Well, anything can arise in meditation." He said anything can arise when you meditate, and he said human beings are capable of anything, and he said that's why I don't want to remove the word evil in the puja. He said, I said, "Do you mean because, in our present life, in our present situation, our lives are quite sheltered, But if we're in a situation, say, of civil war or something like that, we just don't know how we would respond." And, and he said, that's exactly it. He said, human beings are capable of anything. But then he gave me a teaching. And he said, "You've been practicing the Dharma for a long time. And there are certain things you're going to do, and there are certain things that you're not going to do." And he said, "So next time that you're on solitary retreat and fear arises, and your darker side arises, you don't need to respond with fear." And I've never been afraid. I've never been afraid, really, on solitary retreats. And I've had to face all sorts of things. I do a lot of solitary retreats. I had to face all sorts of things. But that fear was, I just bring to mind Bhante's words, and I didn't need to respond with fear. I could just be with my experience and not respond with fear. And that was such a good teaching. But then he just kept me there, and he kept me there, and he kept talking to me. And I felt he was giving me his blessings, because I think he knew that we wouldn't meet again, not in this life. And it felt as if I was receiving his blessings. He just kept me talking. And I left. And 6 months later, he died, and I was at his funeral. And it was at Adhisthana, and many, many people were gathered together. And I think it was the greatest spiritual experience of my life, being at his funeral. And it was as if something was happening. This may sound exaggerated, but it really felt like this. It was a bit like being in a sutra. It felt like being in a Mahayana sutra. And it felt as if something was happening which was of significance to the universe. and a great teacher was dying, and this had some sort of significance in the universe. And I think I've always felt, and he'd always said himself, that Triratna, it exists on many, many different levels. On one level it exists on a physical level, but it also exists on spiritual levels as well. And that you can think of the order as being a bodhisattva. Maybe one person alone can't do very much, but if you think of a number of people together committed to the same spiritual ideal, they can be a force for good in the world. And I feel that Triratna is a force for good in the world. And anyway, I remember particularly his body being lowered down into his burial mound, and Padmavajra reading the root verses of the six bardas, which is a text about death, and it felt like a tremendous event. Anyway, that was Sangharakshita, and my faith in him, my appreciation for him continues to grow the longer I'm at Padmaloka, because we study him every year again and again on our retreats. And I'll just speak more briefly about two other spiritual friends, my kalyana mitras, Kamalashila and Padmavajra. And I took those kalyana mitras when I moved to Sweden because I wanted to feel connected with people that I looked up to. And Kamalashila I'd known for over 40 years, and he's a meditator. He's a very well-known meditation teacher, and he was very, very important to me, particularly in terms of meditation and that whole side. And Padmavajra, I live with Padmavajra. We're on the ordination team together, and he's a great speaker. He's a great Dharma teacher, and maybe perhaps certainly one of the best Dharma teachers in the movement. I'm sure most of you heard some of his talks. But what's really good about Padmavajra, he's also a very good spiritual friend. And, you can come back from, say, a long solitary retreat or something like that. You've had lots of experiences. But I go and see Padmavajra, and I sit down with Padmavajra, and he puts everything in a bigger perspective, because his perspective on the spiritual life is bigger than my own. And he helps me to see those experiences in a deeper and more far-reaching way. And Kamalashila died last year. That was very, very important. I miss him very much, but I still feel in contact with him on a spiritual level, and I actually live with Padmavajra. So there's so much more I could say about spiritual friendship, but for me, it's one of the great joys of living the spiritual life, and it's the riches of the spiritual life. And I think, to sum up, the way that we sum up spiritual friendship is as a mutual vital responsiveness, and an exploration of the spiritual world in complete harmony and complete honesty. And sometimes, when you're in communication with people, you feel there's no limit. There's no limit to how far you can actually go in communication. And I definitely see spiritual friendship as a spiritual practice. It's not just having coffee with an order member. It's a whole exploration of the spiritual world. And I'm very, very glad. One of the things I really value is I have such good friends. And in the order, we're together all our lives. And there are these friends who I've had for 40 years or so, and I keep meeting different situations. So I just want to make it clear, meditation is really important, but it's not a whole spiritual life in itself. There's friendship, there's devotional practice, there's Dharma study, there's ethics, there are festivals and celebrations, and it all adds up to a whole life practice. And I personally believe that to make spiritual progress, you need to actually bring the whole of yourself, your emotional self, your intellectual self, your volitional self, into an affinity with the Dharma. And that's a gradual process that unfolds over many, many years and many decades. There's no fast path. If you like, this is the fast path, but it's just steady progress. It's not about the peak experiences. It's about just steady application, year after year, decade after decade. And it's such a good life. It's the best life. Yeah. So I'll stop there.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.